Hi, and welcome back to the Mind of the Writer. So today I wanted to talk about something that I'm really passionate about, and that's the relationship between the writer and the reader. If you remember, or if you'll recall the very first official video that I posted on this channel, this was the video in which I showed the dynamic of the child escaping the stresses and traumas of their domestic reality, escaping into their mind. That child then grows up, and then the adult has developed this coping mechanism and disappears into their mind. And this can create fairly toxic thinking, whether that be narcissism or limerence or obsessive thoughts. And then in the video, I talked about, well, what would happen if the individual learned how to harness that internal world into a story and then pass that story on to the reader. And the reader then would benefit from that world. The reader would detach from their domestic reality and take refuge from their stresses and their traumas and escape into the story. And so all of a sudden you've got this transmission of an internal world from the writer to the reader, and both are benefiting from that from that transition, or from that transferal from writer to reader, from creator to consumer. So to add to that, I wanted to remind you of what I said a couple videos ago about the author dipping into their emotional wellspring to find all of that raw emotion to flood into the story, to flood into the characters, and for that to be quite powerful for it to reach the reader. And if the writer is feeling those emotions very deeply, they're very powerful, the reader on the other end will pick up on all of that and also, feel those same emotions. So if you think about it, you've got both the writer and the reader detaching from their domestic reality. The emotional line, the emotional bond is between them. And this is just, for me, it's really fascinating, but it's also really special. I want you to think about the author D.H. Lawrence. So his dates are 1885 to 1930. And I've read most of his work, not for ages, but I have read most of his work. But he was writing Lady Chatterley's Lover quite close to his death, with him dying in 1930. But if you think about this book, I mean, it was quite revolutionary for its time. It was very avant-garde and very explicit. And in order for him to write like that, he would have had to have pumped that full of his sexual energy in order to make it work. And what intrigues me about this is you've got him, pumping this novel full of his sexual energy, over 100 years ago. And then somebody now reading that in, let's say, on another continent, completely different time period, different century, and being aroused by that work, picking up on that sexual energy. Well, that energy, carried by the characters, carried by the story, completely defies distance, and it defies time. And I think that is such a magical thing. When I was a little girl, my father used to tell me that the nearest star was 4 light years away. And he would say that starlight that you're seeing now, for you it's in the present, but it's really 4 years old, or maybe it's 100 years old, or maybe it's 1,000 years old, depending on how old the star is. And I like to think of the relationship between the writer and the reader as very similar to that. So as a reader, you're reading in the present, you're experiencing the story in the present, and you're experiencing the emotions in the present. But those emotions, or the power, the energy that's eliciting your emotion, left its source maybe 100 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, but in the past, but it's now part of your present. And it's just a strong energetic bond between the source and the receiver, just like the starlight. I love to imagine a writer, a few hundred years ago writing by candlelight or by lamplight, and then someone now reading that very same work on a computer screen and feeling the emotion that the author put into it, 100 years or a couple of 100 years previously. Very, very magical. So I want you to think about that, the relationship between the writer and the reader being like the relationship between the starlight and the person seeing the starlight in the present. And just know that this energy defies, it defies distance and it defies time. So we'll see you next week on The Mind of the Writer.